Hey guys, what's up? Thanks for coming to Bitcoin and the Bible week 3 of the small group. I have a lot to cover today, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. Proverbs 3:13 says, "Blessed are those who find wisdom, those who gain understanding, for she is more profitable than silver and yields better returns than gold." And I think that this verse, to kick us off, is really the way that we can start to look at how to value things, because items in our world, silver and gold, even those are less profitable and don't yield what knowledge, what understanding and wisdom give us. And God, being the one who provides the understanding and the wisdom and owns that, is essentially what we're going to be talking about today, is that ownership and that how God enables us to carry that, to own it, and whether or not that's even biblical at all. Last time we talked about how work is a gift from God and that He allows us the freedom to store the time and wealth and money that is not easily created and therefore is not squandered. And I think silver and gold being a reference of that, it takes a lot of energy and to mine silver and to bring gold out of the ground. And that God giving us that work and even giving us the reward of being able to use that as a money, that is the foundation that we can start to build our civilization on. It's what they did in Jesus' time. But there's a hidden devastation from modern money in our civilization. The hidden devastation is that, we've talked about it a lot, is that the wealth is being extracted from the money and that it buys you less over time. By gaining knowledge and understanding that God gives us about money, we can begin to build a financial future that He has for us, not that the world tells us that we need. Something important to remember about work is that work came before the fall. It says that, according to Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve doubted the truthfulness of God by believing the lie that Satan was telling them. When truth is constantly assaulted by our culture, how do we seek truth that holds the highest value? Right? How do we find and seek out that where we should put our time and our energy? Ultimately, lying is a manifestation of sin. When Adam was questioned about his wrongdoings, he shifts the blame towards the woman. And children lie. I mean, you find this out at a really young age. As a parent, they're really good at lying. And they're not necessarily taught that. It's just something that they're inherently born with. And they manifest those lies. It just comes from within. But once we are saved, we delight in truth. We don't rejoice in lies and deception. And so if the money that we're using on our day-to-day or with each other is predicated on lies and deception, then we are unwillingly or unknowingly going around just lying to each other. And in the podcast, he says God hates lies. I don't know if it's possible for God to hate anything, but it says that we should be acting in the character that He has designed us to live in. So doing that with gold and silver in today's age is extremely challenging because it's heavy, it's hard to move, it takes security to protect it and get it from one place to another. When we look at the financial world around us, we can see that talking about our dollar-based system, that the Federal Reserve is not an open ledger. It's not an open system. It's not auditable. Therefore, it's not truthful. It's deceptive. So If we want to rejoice in the financial world that God will bless, we should use knowledge and wisdom to uphold a system like Bitcoin that is showing the truth and the reality of the financial transactions that are taking place. We've talked a lot about the open ledger and running a node and how you can take ownership and you can start doing that today. But if we have a worldview where we're just trusting centralized authorities, we know that we're lying, and we know that they're lying, and we are essentially just partaking in all of that. Bitcoin solves the double spending problem, where you can state that someone has more resources than they have. No one can spend 2 Bitcoin if they only have 1. This relates to the story of Adam and Eve because they walked with the heart of God. They knew him firsthand. When they sinned, they actively chose to detach from God, hiding from his presence, becoming afraid of the Creator and the punishment. And we live in a world today where we know that obfuscation or hiding from others, the reality of others, we're essentially lying, not just to ourselves, but then to others. That obfuscation can come in the form of double spending, where banks can spend more than they have, or where you can use a credit card and buy something and just owe it back later. Not to say that just using credit cards is a sin, but we're human. We're greedy. We're still liars. We still make mistakes. But Bitcoin is a system that is designed to help you from knowingly participating in sin. And it's not to say that using Bitcoin isn't a sin. Like, you can use Bitcoin for things that are sinful. And you can, there's still companies out there that spend more Bitcoin than they have because they run a company where they can borrow more money than they have to buy Bitcoin with. And this is just a legacy money trick. It's not necessarily that we're sinning against God when we're using credit cards, but we're borrowing from our tomorrow, even when it's not promised. We all have the ability to turn away from the sinful nature of these transactions. And we all have the ability to just spend what we have. We don't have to become indebted to one another. We can turn from that system that allows that to occur, and we can turn towards a system where it is harder to do so or not allowed. When God sets up his economy, he gave Moses the 10 Commandments. Many of these commandments, they speak directly to the sinful nature that we struggle with, like greed, coveting, and theft. I shall not steal. I do not bear false witness. Shall not covet your neighbor's house. By God showing us in the Mosaic Law how God does business, it's by just weights, or by equal weights in Exodus 18. By doing business with one another, we are essentially exchanging our work or our life energy, which is finite. If that system of exchange is built on theft and deception, it will force us as people to develop other systems around that theft and deception instead of having one built on truth and equal reward for everyone. For instance, banks have to provide you the ability to reverse a transaction. If someone defrauds you, they have up to 28 days after the transaction to say, I want my money back. But that system requires more theft because those systems take more time and more energy and more people involved to get that money back to you. Bad checks, stealing credit card numbers, money laundering, counterfeit dollars. If the fiat system was a garden, the ripest fruit in the garden would be the fruit of fraud and deception. But if Bitcoin is a system, if the Bitcoin system is a garden, the ripest fruit in its garden would be the fruit of labor and collective efforts. Genesis 3 says that because of the fall, no longer would the work of man create yield to itself, or would his hands create the yield itself to hand as his work. It would include pain, difficulty, and inefficiencies. That's a known fact from God, that our work is going to be harder because we have sinned. And work, also being the greatest satisfaction of our life, also includes this pain. It's hard to go to work because it doesn't yield itself to you. I think about this in Bitcoin because of a key feature called the difficulty adjustment. And when you're mining Bitcoin, people always have asked me, well, if I just plug in a bunch, do I get a bunch more? And it's no, you don't, because it's fair for everyone. Roughly every 2 weeks, the difficulty to find a Bitcoin either ratchets up or ratchets down, depending on the amount of miners plugged in. So if a nation state, a country, wants to mine a bunch of Bitcoin, they can't just go out and plug a whole bunch in and take everyone else's, because it's about collective efforts. If everyone is working together on the same thing and someone new comes on the network with a very large amount of work, they don't necessarily just receive a bunch more. It's that everyone's work becomes harder. The network, it becomes a little bit more difficult or a little bit easier if people are unplugging to be able to find the next set of Bitcoin or the next block. Zooming out, however, you can see that the network will never return to its previous state that it was a month or a week or a year ago. Is that as miners plug in and as they stay online to secure the network, it becomes harder to find a Bitcoin. And miners don't always stay online. Sometimes there is no excess energy, or it becomes so hard to work on finding a Bitcoin that people have to unplug their miners. In fact, I just had to at my house because my electric bill was a little too high, so I had to unplug my miners. And that speaks to the inefficiencies that God has already placed on our work. And this is more than just working with our hands. This is about working with our hands to provide for the network security of work. But Bitcoin does not necessarily fix the human heart. Bitcoin doesn't fix that people must work for others. And it does not fix that people will have pain, difficulty, and inefficiencies in their work. Whether it's working with your hands, there's those inefficiencies and that pain, or whether it's working like a Bitcoin miner working to find Bitcoin, it will become harder. Bitcoin allows us to return to God-glorifying work. God is the only one who can change your heart. However, Bitcoin can allow you to work towards a system that allows you to become a better fisher of men. Because you no longer have to work to be stolen from. You're not working towards a system that you know is stealing from you. You can work towards a system where it allows you to save and give and purchase more tomorrow. If you can purchase, if I know that my money buys me more over time, not less over time, then I can also rest assured that I can give more over time, not less over time. Every Sunday, we get that feeling that we need to tithe or we need to give. We get the opportunity to at the very least. And I don't know about you, but I've felt in the past like I can't give today because I didn't save enough. That doesn't exist in a system like Bitcoin. Given a long enough time horizon and looking forward into the future, you can see that you can give more tomorrow because your money will buy you more tomorrow. And that's not to say the price doesn't go down. It definitely does, and it can change over time. But it gives you the ability to drop your time preference and forget about this short-term thinking. In enough time, you will have the ability to give above and beyond what you had been able to purchase prior. In the book, The Price of Tomorrow by Jeff Booth, he talks about it in the form of making bread. And I kind of summarized it by saying this. If we make a bread machine that gets better at making bread, we can just assume with our understanding and wisdom that it shouldn't cost us more to buy that bread. It should cost us less. Because if it was taking 10 people 10 hours a day to make 10 loaves of bread, and this new bread machine comes in and it only takes one person 1 hour a day to make 10 loaves of bread, then the state of supply and demand says that, again, over a long enough period of time, the price of the bread or the value of the bread should fall to meet the cost that it takes to make the bread. However, because we're in a system that has where we price the bread in dollars that can be printed infinitely, the money printer can print money faster than the bread machine can make bread. And no matter how good the bread machine gets, we have to be able to outperform the money printer so that we, in essence, no matter how good we get at making bread, it will always cost more because they can always just print more dollars. And they will. This has been true since 1913. Over 100 years, we've known this. This is the wisdom and the understanding that comes with looking at our worldview through what Christ says, through what God says, which is to not give the power of money to governments and people, but to give it to Him. Bitcoin is the first free and open market that we have available to us. So because if we moved our system, instead of pricing our bread in dollars and we decided we're going to price our bread in Bitcoin, now no one has the ability to print more Bitcoin. So the price of bread falls over time. It doesn't go up over time, long enough time. Again, the price of Bitcoin does go down relative. However, it allows you to drop that time preference and move forward into a system where you can price your bread in Bitcoin rather than pricing it in dollars, which is printed infinitely. That's episode number 9 about the implications of the fall. And this ultimately brings up a great kind of conundrum, which is, okay, like, we don't necessarily have ownership over our dollars. We know that the government owns those. In fact, they've made that very clear, that we don't own dollars. They're a debt. And so episode 10 starts to talk about secondary sovereignty, and this idea of what sovereignty is ownership in a sense, or being able to say what's mine is mine and have control over it. And Bitcoin being the first digital property, We need to make sure that we're exercising what God says about property rights and about ownership. So before we talk about sovereignty, we need to look at what God's sovereignty is and his ownership over the entire universe. God asserts his governmental control over everything. In Psalms 24, 1 through 2, it says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live there." Job 41:11 says, "Who has a claim against me that I must pay? Everything under the heavens belongs to me." And we are biblical Christians, and God owns everything and does with it what he pleases. In Job 39, 1 through 2, it says, Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you watch when the doe bears her fawn? Do you count the months till they bear? Do you know the time that they will give birth? This speaks to God owning time. And in Job 38:36, it says, "Who gives the ibis wisdom? Or who gives the rooster understanding?" God owns wisdom and understanding too. For man to rule over the world that God equips us with, there has to be an ownership that he allows for us. This is where that idea of secondary sovereignty comes in. God owns everything, and God does have sovereignty. What they argue in this podcast is that man has stewardship. And they discuss this idea of an almost secondary or proxy sovereignty, an authority to use what God owns for us to keep it well, to tend the garden, right? Just as God delegated Adam and Eve to take care of the Garden of Eden, he delegates to us to use the gift for his glory. He allows us tremendous sovereignty over our bodies and our own life. Other than killing ourselves, which would violate the commandment, that primary sovereignty is never given to us. We have that ability to end our life, and that's what I was saying in that last sentence. Just try to summarize that, because I feel like I read the sentence out loud. But the primary sovereignty being the ability to own it for yourself. That primary sovereignty in our own life effort is to stay alive. God is in charge, and he retains absolute ownership over his creation. The way that he delights in his creation is by allowing us the decision of stewardship and ultimately placing that over this secondary sovereignty. Taking that secondary sovereignty and just saying, what's mine is mine and I'll use it the way I want to use it, discredits the idea that God is in control. But being good stewards of what we have and saying, I can use what I have because God's given it to me, that is what we are called to. The Bible does talk about having personal property rights and about having ownership. One story in Genesis 14, 1 through 16, Abram's family had their personal property stolen from them, from King Sodom. And Abram retaliates in the story and takes back what is rightfully his. But not only does he keep it for himself, his own property, but the king actually responds and says, take all the property for yourself. And Abram replies by saying, I swear to God, the high God, creator of heaven and the earth, this solemn oath, I'll take nothing from you, not so much as a thread or a shoestring. I'm not going to have you going around saying, I made Abram rich. Nothing for me other than what the young men ate and their share of the men who went with me. Meaning that the men that helped him defeat King Abram were going to get their property back. They were all on the same land. But he left 10% of the loot or the property with King Sodom. It was rightfully his. And Abram does not break that from what he does. Not only does Abram show what God believes is individual property rights, but he also shows that he will not take something from King Sodom. The concept of finders keepers does not exist with God. Sorry, there was a birthday party out in the lobby, so I have to switch to in here. The concept of finders keepers does not exist in God's kingdom. In his economy, property is worked for. It's protected with stewardship. And in Bitcoin, you own your private keys. They are yours to keep. There's no one that gives you permission to Bitcoin other than God himself. And in this way, we should have the same type of laws or rules around that ownership that he gives to us. Obviously, we shall not steal. We shall not covet other people's money or other people's items or Bitcoin. It's a God law that states that we shall not desire the property of another individual. One of the questions they pose in the podcast is, should we sell all of our property and give it all to the church? Should we live in a world where we give up our ownership to the church? In Acts 2:44 through 45, it says, all the believers were together and had everything in common. So they sold their property and possessions to give to anyone who had a need. We should definitely provide financially to those in need. The world and people in Bitcoin that are very prominent, even the president right now has said, do not sell your Bitcoin. But I believe that God is trying to say we should send our Bitcoin to others so that we can provide the same properties that Bitcoin has to others. Does property rights exist because of a government? Or does the government protect our property rights? There's a story where God tells Abraham to go inherit a land. And in order for him to get there, he has to go through Egypt. In the story, Pharaoh tries to marry his wife Sarah because Abram was very scared that if Pharaoh found out they were married, that he would kill Abram for his wife. So he told Sarah to lie and say that she was Abram's sister. But Pharaoh still wanted to marry Sarah. And when he found out that the truth that Abram was married to Sarah, even though he was mad, he sent them off with their possessions, including the silver and the gold. It's very clear here that private property in the form of a dictator like Pharaoh, even in this argument, he is able to give Abram back what's his, what's rightfully his. And governments don't necessarily provide private property to people. That's given by God. It's not to say that a government can give you private property rights means that they can also take them away. And they can't. Only God can. In terms of Bitcoin, especially, because all it takes is remembering a seed word or seed phrase, and you have access to your Bitcoin because it's yours. And like we've talked about, it's not necessarily mine, my sovereignty, I do with it what I want. It's I get to use this because God allows me the freedom to, and it's a benefit that I get to use for others. Even through the Bible, you see terms of not a government that is giving private property rights, but a community. Abram, for instance, purchases a property from a Hittite and buries his wife Sarah there. And when it comes time for his son Jacob to be buried there, some 170 years later, the land is still recognized by being Abram's family's. And the community is the ledger. The community knows that that is Abram's property, and that lasted through generations. And that's what keeps that alive and true. It's not a government that allows the property right of Abram's family. It's the community. Paul states that human government is a servant, which can serve us to promote God and discourage evil. Capital punishment, for instance, is governments taking the ultimate property, which is your life. And governments are able to provide for people, not for people who serve the government, but they can provide for people. When God brings government into the picture, government was supposed to be for our good and for His glory. That's because that's what He does with everything. Government has a purpose, but it's a very limited purpose. With respect to Bitcoin in this scenario, digital property is owned by God. Even the government is currently going through the process of trying to legislate whether or not they see Bitcoin as personal property. There are more Bitcoin private keys than there are atoms in the observable universe. And that means that not only can everyone on Earth have a Bitcoin private key, but everyone on Earth can have as many private keys as they could need in their life. Because of this, Bitcoin cannot be confiscated. And it respects sovereignty by removing the need for violence or theft. Another aspect of this is that you are 100% responsible for securing your Bitcoin private keys. And you must take that responsibility when you own it. Once you understand the security, you can take the power that money allows us to have, and you can put it back in the hands of its rightful owner, which is God. This soberness of the sovereignty is good and must be taken seriously if God has allowed us to steward it well. Owning Bitcoin is expressing that you take ownership for your secondary sovereignty that God allows you to have without the authority or acknowledgement from a government that requires that's requirements are to protect your sovereignty. It's really wild that you can unlock this freedom in your own life, and that in the same ways that God has allowed us to, store food and shelter and have our own life and control our own life, He also allows us to control this. And this has so many implications for your business and for your life and for your financial handlings that I don't think anyone should go another day being a believer without understanding that they can take ownership of the things that they have with respect to who gave it to you, who the owner of it is. 1 Thessalonians 4:11 says, "Attend your own business and work with your hands." We are to use our giftedness to act according in the body of Christ. Not everyone's gifted in the same way, and you might not feel very gifted in this area of Bitcoin. That's why it's important that we all rely on each other and that we lead a quiet life to advance the kingdom. We know that not everyone's gifted the same because Cain and Abel, one attended the flock and one attended the land. One was good at crops and one was good at cattle, for instance. But all people are people of God. But we're not cookie cutters. We're not all the same, and we all have very different passions and skills. Once we accept that God has made us unique in the abilities to trade with one another, the skill takes time to develop. I think about me being a photographer and how it's taken 15 years for me to develop the skill of not just taking photos, but selling photos, and the ability to tell people why they should value photos and how it's almost like a time machine, and you can look back on things that you previously did, but you can't do that with any other device. It also reminds me of how I have made mistakes in my business and maybe done too many things that were not in my skill because I was seeking something that God didn't desire for me to have. I wanted it for me. I wanted to have it. But God didn't desire that for me, and so it didn't happen, or I wasn't able to keep it for very long. That failure needs to be measured. Someone's business might fail in order to let someone else's succeed. And pricing your services is obviously a huge part of that. Sound money allows you to price services accordingly. It gives you the true value of things. Because if the price is constantly changing, like with inflation or with dollars, you don't get a good gauge on how to measure any failure, or really even measure your skill. If my photography is not needed, no matter what price I put on it, people will not purchase it because it's not needed. For God's purpose to be accomplished, we each need to take our businesses or our personal life dealings and use it truthfully in a society that we live in, and price it to test and see if others value it the same. And not priced in dollar terms, we can price our services directly in Bitcoin. And by doing so, we can price our services on a standard of truth and use that as the standard for other people to purchase in. Doing so, pricing our services in Bitcoin, it dramatically decreases the cost of doing business. We talked last week about how much the banks and the Visa networks take as a fee, distorting the true value that others have for things. Conducting trade in the 21st century involves not looking at the 20th century. The means of trade that we have are directed on the type of economy that we have. We have a digital economy. I wouldn't be here today talking to you if it was not for the internet. If the trade is not simplified because of these things, then we have an economy of theft. And look back at the economy that God made with Abram. The economy was made with gold and silver. In fact, Egypt was the main place where gold and silver was exchanged, and people would come to Egypt to trade. They had to trust that Egypt was charging the right amount for grain, for instance. That was the main product that was distributed through Egypt, and how they traded really their gold or silver for food. And when the Tower of Babel happened and everyone was confused on languages, that event caused people to use money as the communication method and the weights as the communication method. It's what arose naturally. Bitcoin is the same way. This currency and store value is what's being chosen as the primary asset in the marketplace. And it's because it holds its true value. Even the government right now is saying, like Vivek Ramaswamy said, that he believes that Bitcoin will be the primary hurdle rate rather than the 10-year government bond. Bitcoin has a superior value for what money can be in our world. If the money that we're using can be borrowed at a 0% interest rate, and there is essentially no reward for the efforts of our work, people lose the ability to be rewarded at all. And they might start to ask themselves, like, what am I even good at? What skill did God give me if all I'm seeking is the ability to have more money or use money at a 0% rate? If people say war got us out of a depression, it's not necessarily true. If it were, I would go around and smash all the windows in my house because I would become wealthier. It's not accurate. To be more accurate, the economy of war does not produce, it destroys. War exists to destroy others on the benefit of someone else. We can't sideline ourselves either and just say that, what we've worked on and everything we've saved has to just go in the dump and go, straight into Bitcoin. You do have the ability every day to take a step and to move towards something that promotes decentralization. When social norms are to not save, you get this disconnect from reality. Because when an economy saves, the economy can prosper. It can buy more over time, not less over time. And this brings up a great point, because when you have an economy that is promoted on decentralization and you don't have to buy a certain amount of something, you can start to change the effects that you have in other areas. Let me say it this way. When someone in Africa purchases Bitcoin, let's say they did before you do. Let's say they have it while I'm recording this video, and they buy $1 worth. When you come to the system and you buy Bitcoin, it increases the value of theirs, because you trading your dollars for Bitcoin means that the price of Bitcoin goes up ever so slightly, but it does. And so just by you purchasing Bitcoin and moving your energy from a dollar-based system to a Bitcoin system means that other people that are on that system also receive the benefit of being able to purchase more over time. That is one way that you can see that a rising tide raises all ships. But that's not to say that everyone buying Bitcoin means that everyone's saved. Isaiah 33:22 says, "For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king, he will save us." Christ returning to earth one day will happen, and judgment will happen to all of us. He will rule the earth again, and we cannot lose sight of that. We are not here to worship money. We're not here to give glory to money. We're not here to speculate about the price of gold or the price of Bitcoin or the price of a house it's all the same. We're here to promote and seek the kingdom of God and have Him alone save us. God judges us all the same. We don't get special treatment if we have more Bitcoin or less Bitcoin, or more cash or less cash. You can't do more good deeds to get into heaven. And he wants us as Christians to use money that reflects that righteousness and justice. Righteousness, defined, is the quality or state of being morally right or justifiable. When you ask someone, is there a just thing? Is there a thing as being morally right? It can show you a lot about their worldview. If God gives us the mandate to tend the earth, which he does, we need to align our money, our governments, our church, our human institutions. All of those should align with righteousness, to be morally right, and to have justice, have fairness between everyone. I've said it before personally that we have a moral obligation. But the more I research this, I see that this is more of a mandate. We will never fully get there. We won't get it right every time. But if we're knowingly using a system that does not have the same rules for everyone, we are knowingly doing something that God does not want us to align with. For instance, I'm in the United States, so I can purchase stocks. Someone in Africa can't purchase United States stocks. They have the inability to because they're not a US citizen. Everyone has the ability to purchase Bitcoin. We're responsible with how we work, how we live, and how we interact with others. With respect to money, knowing these truths that we've been discussing over the past couple weeks, we can now have the blinders taken off. And we can see that all of us have real eyes underneath that can stay focused on the thing, and that is Jesus. And staying focused on the thing that allows us to build his kingdom, to build his worldview, and not just pay attention to what so-and-so is saying, or even what I'm saying, to align and to what he says, and he says how to treat people. If the worldview that we're using is that our system must adhere to equality, or that everyone has to be treated differently depending on their background or their parents or where they live, it doesn't align with God's truth, and therefore it can lead to a sinful path. In Leviticus 19:15, Moses says, "You shall not do injustice in judgment. You shall not show particularity to the poor, nor give preference to the great." In James 2:9 it says, "But if you show particularity, you are committing a sin, and you are committed by the law as violators." God's message about treating everyone is the same, and it's repeated through the Bible that we are to treat everyone the same. So how does this align to Bitcoin? No matter the person on the planet, they can own Bitcoin. Unlike homes, which require a down payment, you make a certain amount of money, and you have a good credit score, or stocks, which is dependent upon where you live or your age, I believe. Gold, silver, or even dollars, you have to have a certain authority that gives you those rights. But everyone has the same fees and the same ability to own Bitcoin. So when you transact on Bitcoin, it doesn't matter if you're moving $1 million or $5, it's the same fee. Everyone has the same cash value in Bitcoin. There's no bailout involved. If I lose my Bitcoin, I lose it. It's gone forever. The bailout opportunity that exists in our world steals from other people. And so that doesn't work in Bitcoin. That doesn't happen. Everyone who puts in work has the same standing. If there is no central authority that's, giving you the reward. It's controlled by everyone. Everyone gives you the reward because everyone works together to advance the properties that the network has set forth. Bitcoin is controlled by everyone. And so there's not one person that can make the decisions or that can make the choice for you. And hear me out, we all wish that we got in sooner, or that we bought at a certain price point, or that we bought more at a certain price point. But if we're being honest with ourselves, the only reason that we haven't yet is because we've been intellectually lazy. And we can all have the same opportunity to completely miss out. This is not like an early stock investment. This isn't like a, insider trading where just a few small people know about it and soak up all the supply. There's no centralized body that's going to change the value of, a provided Bitcoin. There's no way for them to steal your savings. Look at older systems like gold. Gold was essentially made illegal in the United States through the order by President Roosevelt, and it was centralized so that it could be rehypothecated. It could be, U.S. has a certain amount of gold. They can print enough dollars to match that gold level, but they wanted to print as many dollars as they could. So they centralized the gold and essentially backed it with nothing. And the whole reason I'm doing this small group is to help people see that by holding Bitcoin and using it for yourself, you can support a system that has a foundation on decentralization and allows you to not rely on another entity to transact. Jesus, for instance, cut out the market makers in the church. I worry that we have allowed them back in our local churches just kind of unknowingly, and that they're wreaking havoc on the way that our churches are experiencing growth because we have allowed market makers back in to the church, and we are acting in ways that force us to keep those market makers there. It's because of a fallen world, because of what we talked about at the very beginning of this, which is that we have all sinned, and we all are making mistakes, some weekly, daily, sometimes unknowingly. But once we have the knowledge and the understanding that comes from God, He can provide for our church again. He can provide, we can put the power of money back in His hands because it's His to begin with. Our churches should be built on a financial foundation that is not predicated on a form of taxation or stealing from some and giving to others, or by inflation, which is the pricing out of the poor and only allowing the rich to buy. I would ask, who are we placing our trust in? Are we placing our trust in the government to provide for us? Or are we trusting God to provide for us using the tools that He has allowed us domain over? For those of us that are wealthy, I need to give you a reality check because that's the majority of people in the United States. I don't know if I've seen a homeless man without a cell phone. And that's wealth. It's communication. We need to start seeing what we have available to us and what God has already given us domain over to be able to control and to change and to move into a different direction. Because Bitcoin has a 21 million cap, a finite supply, I talked about this earlier, that if I buy today and I'm in a wealthy country, I can help someone in another country that has less wealth because a rising tide raises all ships. And just by me buying Bitcoin, I'm helping their financial situation. I'm helping lift the floor of what they can do in their area. It doesn't stop there either. Deuteronomy 15:11, Moses says, "For the poor will never cease to be in the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall freely open your hand to your brother, to your needy, to the poor in your land. So God is saying there's always going to be poor among you, right? This fact in the Bible allows us to not stop at just buying Bitcoin, but then to freely give it to our local church, to a mission, to whatever is going to advance the kingdom of God. And if they need to sell that for dollars or sell that for pesos or whatever country they're in to do their thing, that's what they are required to do. That's what advances the kingdom still. So it's not just Bitcoin that does that. It's just building it on a system that is not predicated on theft, that does not perpetuate it further. We need to see that our money, even our Bitcoin, is on loan from God, and that for it to be used for the benefit of others. That's the whole point of money in general. We need to teach others about why we use Bitcoin and why they should use it too, how they'll benefit from holding it, but not just in dollar terms, that they can ultimately become a blessing by giving. Luke 12:48 says, to whom much is given, much is required. And I would like to challenge anyone in a wealthy country and ask, do you know the difference between saving and hoarding? This requirement is most illustrated by saving and giving in Bitcoin. It's one of the hardest things to do. When you understand that there's a finite supply and that there's only so much, and that you have to work towards money or things to be able to buy this or sell your things to buy this, and that once it's gone, it's gone. It's no longer in your, in your stewardship. It's not in your control anymore. Giving Bitcoin is the hardest thing to do, but it's important. In the Bible, giving to the poor does refer to giving money, but it also refers to providing work, which is how Bitcoin is created, by proof of work, by working towards finding excess energy, by using a Bitcoin miner and paying for that electricity, which could go to the poor, to the needy, to somewhere else. And it ultimately just comes full circle with this new concept of money being used by God for His glory and for our good. Because when we're giving in Bitcoin, we are giving people the ability to save for themselves, to save for themselves, to learn about it themselves. And that's huge. It takes work to do that. It takes understanding. Took me work to make this whole thing. But bigger than Bitcoin, we should all be starting to look for our unique gifts and our skills that we can use to trade with others, to provide work for others, to encourage one another to do the work, do the research, do the hard thing, because there's a benefit, not just for you, but for you to give back to God, who is ultimately the owner of everything and has given this to you. So that's my encouragement. That's my talk for the day, is just reach toward what God's telling you to do next. Don't just go out and buy Bitcoin. It's not the point of this. Don't just go out and give all your possessions away. That's not the point of this. It's to do the work and to encourage others to do the same, because there's not just a benefit for you, there's glory to Him throughout all of this.